She stepped off the train one day late, dressed dusty, eyes steady. Her groom was already in the ground, killed over water. The banker said, "Send her back east," but a quiet cowboy offered a fair wage, clean ledger, and a room of her own. No romance, not yet. Just shelter, a handshake, and a fight for land worth saving. Then came padlocked gates, stolen water, and a school section no one expected. She stayed, she wrote, she taught letters by lamplight, and when the law came calling, her record spoke loudest. What happens when mercy meets dry land, and a second chance arrives late? But just in time? The train hissed and stilled at Sagebrush Bend just after dawn. Wind tugged at the hem of Hannah Lark's skirt as she stepped down, clutching a carpet bag with both hands. Her boots struck the wooden platform like final punctuation. No one waited. The depot man looked up from his clipboard. "Name?" "Hannah Lark," she said, voice soft but clear. "To marry Mr. Graham Boyd. Scheduled arrival. Yesterday he blinked. Ma'am, Boyd's dead. Shot in a land dispute. Waterline boundary out past High Mesa. Burial was 2 days ago." The news didn't knock her back, just made her eyes blink slower. She nodded once. "Where's the ranch?" The depot man pointed toward the livery. "But, ma'am, there's folks say that land's gonna be seized now." Banker Prentlow filed notices same day Boyd went under. At that, a low voice cut in. "I'll take her." A tall cowboy had stepped from the shade, hat low, boots clean, shirt sun-bleached from long days. He wasn't young, but he stood like the weather hadn't broken him yet. "Name's Eli Mercer. I worked with Boyd, run cattle a parcel down the same ditch. Miss Lark, ain't proper to say, but you're alone here. I've got a spare room, clean meals, and need for someone who can keep ledgers straight. 30-day trial, honest pay. If it don't suit, I'll buy your ticket east." Hannah looked up at him. "No charity." "No, ma'am," he said. "Just a neighborly offer." She adjusted the carpetbag and nodded. "Then I'll earn my keep." They walked the half-mile in silence. Sagebrush Bend spread out flat, then rolled into gentle hills, cradling the dry bones of High Mesa. The sun was rising now, catching on a flicker of silver in the distance. They passed a fresh notice nailed to the fence post. Red seal. By order of Silas Prentlow, District Bank and Ditch Company, notice of default. Water shares under review. Hannah studied it. How long till they act? Sometimes a week, sometimes they don't bother waiting. Boyd missed one assessment. Next thing, they lock the gate and sell it behind your back. She folded the corner of the notice down and kept walking. Eli's bunkhouse sat modest and clean, with one patched curtain and a kettle already whistling. A single room across the breezeway was hers. She put the bag down, opened the ledger, and began to inventory cattle, feed stores, and weather marks on the margins. By midday, she'd reorganized the pantry, labeled shelves, and added proper dates to outgoing orders. Eli watched but didn't hover. "Cook when you want. Eat with the men or not. Room's yours," he said. "No expectations." Hannah said, "A broom and privacy, and I'll get your books clean by week's end." That night, Eli returned from the upper pasture with dust on his sleeves. Hannah had left 2 biscuits on a plate, a note beside it. "Road herd numbers don't match Prentlow's figures. You've been undercredited." Page 12. He read it slowly, then looked out the window. Down in the valley, past the ridge line, a glint of light flickered, metal. "Gates shut," he muttered. They didn't wait. A padlock now hung on the north head gate, where the High Mesa ditch met the fork to his property. Without it, the cattle would lose shade water by Thursday. He set down the plate. Back at the bunkhouse, Hannah had lit one small lamp. She folded a wool blanket, wrote another line in the ledger, then paused. "Mr. Mercer?" she said as he entered. He nodded once. "I didn't come looking for pity." "No," he replied. "I didn't offer any." They stood quiet for a moment, then she handed him a folded page. "A sketch," she said. "I saw the ditch grade slope steeper than Prentlow's chart. If your water reaches the west boundary, we can prove it serves stock directly. Might matter?" Legally, Eli took the page, unfolded it slow. A quiet breath left him. "Miss Lark," he said, voice gravel low. "You plan to stay?" "For 30 days, she said. "Then we'll see." Outside, the wind settled. A coyote howled once, far off. And somewhere, A padlock glinted in the moonlight. A padlock clicked shut downstream, cutting off more than just water. The next morning broke dry and tight-skied. A thin dust hung in the light like the land held its breath. Eli Mercer stood by the empty trough at his north pasture, hat low, eyes scanning the dry trickle from the pipe. A padlock downstream shimmered against the sun. Beside it, 2 men on horseback, Prentlows, sat, easy, rifle slung but idle. They didn't wave. At the bunkhouse, Hannah folded the breakfast cloth and turned pages in the ledger. "We dropped 12 head overnight from the east pen to the shaded slope," she said when Eli stepped in. "Weight and water show it. We'll have lopsided feed costs if the far line stays dry." Eli rubbed his jaw. "I saw." "Should we report it?" He shook his head. "They ain't breaking law, just bending it where folks don't look." Hannah set her pencil down. "Then we make 'em look." By afternoon, she had drawn up a table logging cattle weight, water dates, and weather conditions. Neat lines, clear hand. Beside each day, a footnote: source, high mesa flow. Eli added his field notes: fence posts dry on the north side, moss receding. It wasn't protest, it was record. Prentlow's move came by horseback, not paper. A deputy rode in slow, boots polished and badge catching the sun. He claimed to inspect brand integrity on Eli's herd. No warrant, just pressure wrapped. In polite threat. "Policy shift," the deputy said, tapping his notebook. "Ranchers near assessment disputes get spot checked." "You checking all brands in the valley?" Eli asked. The deputy smiled. "Just the ones on shallow ground." Eli said nothing more, just nodded. "Help yourself." That evening, Hannah hosted her first reading lesson under the porch lantern. The ranch hands, young Clyde and freckled Tom, sat shy at first, boots dusty, fingers stiff, but by the second page they followed along, grinning at missteps and shaking heads at each other's stumbles. "What's this for?" Clyde whispered. Hannah answered, "For the day it matters who can read what's being taken from 'em." By week's end, others came. Nora, Eli's widowed sister from town, brought a pan of cornbread and a hand-stitched copy of Pilgrim's Progress. "If you can read contracts," she said, "you can write your own terms." Then came Tully Briggs, gray-whiskered and muttering, lugging an old prospector's field book. "Got something here," he said to Eli, thumbing past water-stained pages. "Survey line from 70. Not all ditches match today's map. Look." A scratchy drawing showed a spring runoff tracing past the border of Section 16. School land, government-owned, protected. Eli's brow furrowed. "That spring still run?" Tully pointed. "Skirts the school fence behind the old depot. Never been marked proper, just forgotten." "If we can prove it serves public use," Hannah said, leaning in, "they can't block it with private assessment. The law's clear." She turned back to her ledger, wrote a header, public flow and usage log. Below it she listed names: Eli, the hands, Nora, Tully, herself. "They'll call it paperwork games," Eli muttered. "Then let's play honest," she replied. "We don't bluff. We document." At dusk, Nora handed Hannah a parcel tied in string. Inside was a blank affidavit and a folded newspaper clipping about land disputes in Santa Fe. "In case they press you, have your story ready before." "They write it for you," Hannah nodded. Eli watched her long after the lantern burned low. She hadn't flinched once since stepping off that train. She just worked, asked straight questions, and made silence feel like strength. "Miss Lark," he said quietly, "I know it's not what you came for." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "But maybe it's what I'm meant for." The stars were out now, coyotes called somewhere distant, and water still didn't flow where it ought to. The deputy promised to return, but so did the spring and the girl who kept the books. 2 weeks into dry troughs and ledgers run thin, Hannah Lark sat cross-legged on the bunkhouse floor with a tin box of old papers and regret. The previous owner of Eli's neighbor ranch, the man she'd come to marry, had kept every scrap, every canceled check, every clipped receipt. A travel-worn envelope caught her eye. Inside, a copy of a westbound train ticket from Kansas City and a note from the banker, Silas Prentlow, referencing a remitted sum toward transport of matrimonial contractee. Hannah stared at it, heart ticking like Eli's old wall clock. He didn't pay for her. She helped pay to come. She held it in both hands, read it again. Consideration, not charity. That mattered. At the kitchen table, she spread the papers and told Eli, "That man's estate owed me clear contract fulfillment. I wasn't freight. I was an investor." Eli blinked, then smiled, quiet, warm. "You're not just staying out of kindness, are you?" "I'm staying for fairness," she said, "and water. And maybe the garden if it ever rains again." That night, Tully Briggs thumped down a dirt-streaked survey book. "Marked it plain as sunrise," he said, jabbing a tobacco-stained finger. "This runoff line from the high spring cuts right through section 16. Hannah furrowed her brow. "That's school land." "Yup, means it ain't for sale, and no private tax assessment holds, if it serves public interest." Eli leaned in. "Like, if someone teaches school from that land?" Tully grinned. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer." The following morning, Hannah took a walk past the edge of the north pasture, boots crunching through brush. There, tucked behind a weathered cottonwood and an old barbed gate, sat a one-room building with peeling white paint and a red door. She stepped inside. Dust danced in the light, desks stacked in corners. A blackboard cracked across the middle, chalk nubs in a jar. She ran her fingers along the ledge. "This still counts," she whispered. "It has to." Eli's voice came from behind her. "We used to vote here too, town meetings." Before Prentlow moved everything to the depot hall, Hannah turned, eyes glinting. "If I file this place as a teaching site and we show proof of active school use, then Prentlow's control of the spring goes soft," Eli finished. "That's a turn." Back at the house, they laid out the plan. Hannah began assembling what she called a flow ledger, a packet of records, dated and signed, showing water levels, animal counts, grazing days. Eli contributed hand-drawn maps and notes from fence rides. Tully promised to swear to the old survey line. Nora and the ranch hands offered affidavits confirming Hannah's night lessons as formal instruction. "We'll need someone neutral to witness it," Hannah said. "A preacher, or the deputy, maybe." Eli hesitated. "Deputy's been riding both sides." Then the preacher. They agreed. The time had come for a public measure. But first, they needed to make sure Prentlow couldn't twist the records. So Hannah took the full packet, tied in red string, and delivered it by lantern light to Nora in town. "If anything happens," she said, "this version stays clean." Nora nodded. "You're fighting different than most out here, but it feels right." As dawn colored the east sky, Eli stood by the dry headgate again, watching the dust blow over stone. "She thinks like water," he murmured, "soft, but always pushing." Inside the house, Hannah filed her teaching affidavit with a fresh page titled "Public Instruction, School Parcel Number 16, established under Territorial Statute 1872. It wasn't war drums, it was pencils and print and patience. A sealed envelope rests in Nora's safe, ready to show that what's fair can still win if someone's willing to write it down. The church picnic always drew a crowd in Sagebrush Bend, not for the hymns or the pie auction, though those helped. Mostly, it was a place to watch and be watched, where business stitched itself into social seams. Hannah smoothed her skirt, lifted the basket Nora packed, and walked with steady steps beside Eli through the cottonwood shade. Her reading students, 3 boys, a ranch girl, and a freckled shopkeeper's daughter, followed close behind, each holding a lesson page. At the far end of the tables, Silas Prentlow handed hymnals to the preacher, smiling like he'd just delivered the 10 Commandments himself. "Always glad to support community learning," he said loudly, "though we mustn't confuse true education with extracurricular dabbling." His gaze flicked toward Hannah. She didn't blink. She laid her lesson plan beside the lemonade, pinned it with a clean stone, and said to the group, "Reading class resumes tomorrow, 2 o'clock, back of the Red Door Schoolhouse. All welcome. Bring a pencil." The preacher, Reverend Knox, looked between them. Then he nodded and added, "A petition's come for a public meeting to review ditch access. We'll hold it Thursday at sundown, same place." Prentlow's face shifted, but just for a second. Eli tipped his hat. "Appreciate that, Reverend." Afterward, beneath the oaks, pies were judged and violins tuned, but talk turned sharp. The ranch hands muttered about dry troughs. A clerk whispered that new assessments were posted with no notice. A widow from south of the bend said her turnouts ran brown last week. Hannah passed out more copies of her reading flyer, her tone calm, her presence solid. Prentlow drifted near again, this time with the deputy in tow. "Well now, Deputy Garland," he said too cheerfully, "would you look at this noble experiment? Schoolmarm, ledgers, flow measurements. Next thing, we'll be measuring clouds to pay tax on rain." Laughter from two of Prentlow's ranch foremen. The deputy frowned but said nothing. Eli stepped forward, a hand resting lightly on the fence post behind him. "We'll be measuring water the honest way. Day after tomorrow. You're welcome to watch." "You mean Thursday?" Prentlow said, voice slick. "Oh, I do apologize. I've arranged my own assessment for Wednesday. We'll submit results first, I suppose." Hannah met his eyes. "Then we'll be ready Wednesday. May I request the deputy's presence for fairness?" The deputy coughed. "I can manage that." Tully Briggs sauntered up, hands in pockets. "Funny thing," he said, squinting. "Saw boundary stakes near Section 16 were moved just last week. Could swear the original line ran through the old schoolyard survey error," Prentlow said quickly. "Already addressed." Tully sniffed. "Might need a third set of eyes then." As the sun dipped lower, Hannah glanced toward the red door in the distance. "If it's still school land," she said softly, "then children still have a right to gather there. And if they do, the water has a right to follow." The preacher, overhearing, gave her a thoughtful nod. That night, as tables folded and pies disappeared, Hannah stayed to sweep the picnic ground. Eli helped without words. Only when they reached the horses did he speak. "You're braver than I ever knew." "I'm just writing what's true," she said. "Truth doesn't need shouting, just steady paper and time." He smiled. "We'll give it both." At the schoolhouse that evening, she chalked a fresh alphabet line and stacked the attendance sheets. Then she pulled a faded map from her pocket, the one Tully had shown her. The stakes may move, but the earth didn't lie. As shadows lengthened, she lit a lantern in the red door room and whispered to herself, "Let him come early. We'll be ready." The courthouse in Sagebrush Bend didn't have columns or grandeur, just a brick front, dusty windows, and a single clerk who sharpened pencils with a pocket knife. Still, when Eli Mercer stepped inside that Monday morning, wearing his best shirt and carrying Hannah's packet of ledgers and affidavits, he might as well have been walking into battle. "I'd like to file a boundary confirmation petition," he said calmly, "and lodge a formal claim for domestic water rights off the spring on Section 16. School land statute applies." The clerk looked up slowly. "You're the cowboy from the ditch row?" Eli nodded. "Yes, sir. This is by the book." By noon, the papers were sealed with the territorial stamp. Hannah, meanwhile, rode into town with Nora and stopped by Keene's bank. She held a folded sheet, line items and valuation notes from the late rancher's estate, with her savings, Eli's wages, and a loan backed by Nora's boarding house. They placed a quiet legal bid at the upcoming auction. A backup copy of the bid sat in the pastor's office, just in case. By sunset, the documents were in motion. They had laid their claim with paper, not pistols. Prentlow, of course, struck back hard and fast. That night, the north pasture ran dry. Eli found a padlock welded onto the metal turnout gate, not bolted, welded. By morning, he'd moved the cattle to the common crossing below the bluff, a broad shared stretch of creek used for generations by ranchers needing relief flow in dry times. He brought no protest, just a canteen and a salt block. The herd followed slow and tired, ribs showing. Midday, 2 riders from Prentlow's crew appeared, led by foreman Grady Voss. Broad-shouldered, with eyes that squinted like they were always watching lies form. "That's company land now, Mercer," Grady said. "Trespass. Get 'em off." Eli tipped his hat. "Water was always shared here. Not anymore." Grady pointed to a crooked sign. "Private access only. Under claim." "I ain't looking for trouble," Eli said, calm. "Just keeping them from dying." Grady dismounted. His boot hit dust hard. "Then walk them home." Eli nodded once. "All right." He started down the trail, driving the herd slow. Grady watched from the rise, hands on hips. Back at the ranch, Hannah saw the dust first. When Eli returned, his shirt damp and boots crusted, she met him at the fence. "They didn't want you arrested?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet. They want me rattled." She pressed the ledger against her chest. "Are you?" "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'm more sure now than ever." That night, after supper, they found the fence corners smashed. Not cut, kicked in by hoof or boot, boards cracked, wire torn. Tracks led back to the county road. Hannah fetched the hammer while Eli reset the post. "Retaliation's louder than reason," she muttered. Eli smiled without humor. "Let it holler. We'll stay quiet and ready." Afterward, Hannah wrote out a clean inventory. Every tool, every gate, every day of flow. She backed it up again and left a copy in Nora's pie safe. Eli finished the repairs and lit a lantern at the porch rail. One steady glow in the dark. Inside, Hannah opened a fresh page in the ledger and wrote in careful script, "Retaliation noted. Response, lawful, calm, unbowed." Then she closed it, steady hands and steady breath. The wind picked up outside. Down in the cottonwoods, a rider waited in the dark with a folded paper in hand, an arrest warrant with Eli's name. It happened just before dawn. Boots on the porch, a fist on the door, 3 sharp knocks that sounded more like judgment than law. Deputy Wills stood in the morning gray, hat low, warrant in hand. "Eli Mercer," he said, voice dry as fence dust, "you're under arrest for interfering with lawful improvements under Company Charter 14B. Eli didn't flinch. He stepped forward, no boots, no belt. "Mind if I get my coat?" Wills nodded once. "No trouble, please." "Won't." "Be any inside." Hannah watched through the window. Her hands clutched a tin coffee cup. Though the stove hadn't even warmed yet, she didn't cry, didn't speak. Eli turned once, just before mounting into the deputy's wagon. He gave her a small nod, same one he used when a job was done right. And then he was gone, wheels rolling slow through frost. The jail in Sagebrush Bend wasn't much. 1 barred window, a cot, and a bench carved with names older than statehood. Eli sat still. He didn't pace. He just watched dust catch light between slats and thought about what fences needed fixing. Around noon, Prentlow came walking. Not fast, not slow, like a man who'd already decided the ending. He leaned against the bars with a smirk too polished to be earned. "Don't have to be this hard, Mercer." Eli stayed silent. "You dropped that school petition," Prentlow went on. "Withdraw your bid on the North Ranch, and I'll see to it this disappears. Deputy files get real thin when the right hand's writing that the log." Eli blinked once. "I appreciate the offer." Prentlow tilted his head, confused. "You think this is a joke?" Eli's eyes met his. "No, sir. I think it's a pattern. Back at the ranch." Hannah moved like a woman balancing breakables no one could see. She kept the schoolroom open. Young Eli Briggs showed up early, his slate under one arm and his boots clean. Hannah taught with steady tone, not cheer. When one girl asked where Mr. Mercer had gone, Hannah answered without pause. "He's proving something," she said, "that doing right doesn't mean being loud." That afternoon, she posted a notice outside the room, a copy of the territorial statute, highlighting that any parcel used for active schooling on Section 16 carried water rights under the school land grant. Below it, she tacked a roll call, 8 names, each one signed by a parent. Old Nora came by with warm cornbread wrapped in a flour sack. She handed it through the bars to Eli, along with a folded sheet. "From Hannah," she said, "and one from me." Eli unfolded the first, a fresh ledger page documenting cattle flow, water logs, and the recent padlock incident. At the bottom, copy lodged with clerk's office. Will update daily. The second page was an affidavit, Nora's signature and notary mark. "I saw no trespass. I saw no damage. Only a man walking cattle to a public crossing, as done since 1869. Eli folded both pages back with care. "Sun's still coming," he said, mostly to himself. Judge Harlan rode in late Thursday, dust-covered and short on patience. Wills presented the complaint. Eli handed him Nora's affidavit and Hannah's log page. The judge squinted, grunted, and waved it off. "Release him." Outside the jail, the cold wind cut hard. Eli stood still for a moment, then walked toward the post office. Inside, Hannah had left a sealed envelope with the pastor, addressed to the courthouse. Inside, maps, sworn statements, and survey notes, prepared with Tully Briggs's help. The measuring day was tomorrow. Eli left the envelope in the judge's inbox. That night, he oiled his boots, sharpened a pencil, and folded his best shirt. Not for court. For the ditch bank. A lantern flickers beside the schoolhouse door, and a student's hand sketches the flow of water by moonlight. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but half the town stood on the ditch bank. Prentlow's riders were already there, Boots muddy, stakes planted where they hadn't been the day before. A coil of fresh wire leaned against a cottonwood stump. The deputy frowned. He'd been told the markers were original. Tully Briggs nudged the preacher and pointed low with his walking stick. "That cedar root's no more than 2 days cut." The preacher nodded solemn. "That stake's been moved." On the far end of the bank, Hannah helped young Eli Briggs unroll a scroll of hand-drawn maps. They had practiced the night before, sketching by lantern light. Every line was careful, every inch accounted for. "Don't drop it," Hannah whispered. "I won't," the boy said. "Mr. Mercer said to hold it like a calf." The crowd parted. Eli Mercer walked down the slope, shirt pressed, hat brushed, one hand holding a fresh ledger. No one clapped, no one jeered, they just watched. The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, you're late." "No, sir," Eli said, calm, "just on time." He set the ledger on a flat rock, opened it to a signed log of flow measurements, receipts, and photos, hand-drawn and dated by students and parents. Prentlow stepped forward, smirking. "This here's a water test," he said, "not a coloring contest." Deputy Wills raised a hand. "Let him speak." Eli pointed to the spring line. "This water runs beneath Section 16, school land. We've got students meeting 3 times a week in that red-doored room, attendance logged and attested. Law says active schooling gets priority." He turned to Tully, who produced the old company ledger from his coat, a cracked page, brittle as dry leaves, but legible. It named the spring Common. Source: School Reserve, 1871. The preacher stepped forward. "I bear witness to students and lessons held." Parents in the crowd murmured. Nora stepped up and laid a fresh affidavit on the rock. "We ain't asking for more," she said. "Just what's rightly ours." Prentlow turned red. "That land was abandoned." "Not anymore," Hannah said, voice steady. "There's a chalkboard, a bench, and 8 children who know their letters." Just then, a boy ran down the slope. The clerk's apprentice, dust-caked, out of breath. He handed a sealed envelope to Deputy Wills. "The judge sent this." Told me to run it straight. Wills opened it, read slowly, then lifted his head. "Petition to uphold school-based priority use is granted. Headgate will be opened. Tampering carries criminal charge. Complaint against Mr. Mercer is dismissed with prejudice." Prentlow lunged toward the ledger. "That land's mine." He grabbed for the page, but Hannah stepped between them. "You lay a finger on that," she said, "and you'll answer to every child learning to read under that roof." He swung wide, angry, loud, sloppy. Eli caught his arm midair and didn't twist, didn't strike, just held him. "Don't," he said, soft but firm. "It's over." The deputy stepped in and took Prentlow by the collar. "You're under arrest for falsifying public record and interfering with lawful education." The banker stared, stunned. Then his knees buckled, not from pain, just disbelief. The crowd said nothing. No one cheered, but boots shifted, shoulders lifted. A silence of respect settled over the ditch. Eli bent and brushed dirt from the ledger, then closed it. Hannah looked at him, unsure. "Did it work?" she asked. He nodded. "We held." She breathed out once, deep and clean. From the ridge, a light flickered from the schoolhouse. Class would begin soon. And just beyond the preacher's wagon, the auction clerk posted a notice. "North parcel to sell, no minimum bid." The banker's boots dragged through red dust as the deputy led him toward the courthouse steps. The sun had risen full now, bright, cold, merciless. Folks didn't look away. But they didn't gloat either. That wasn't the kind of justice Sagebrush Ben believed in. "Town's quiet this morning," Tully murmured, leaning on his cane. "Quiet like a ledger done right," Eli said, watching Prentlow disappear behind the iron-barred door. The preacher cleared his throat. "Clerk says the auction starts in half an hour." Eli nodded. "We'll be there." But it was Hannah who turned toward him, hands fisted in her shawl. "Eli," she said, "you sure we ought to do this? It's not just numbers on a page anymore." He looked at her. "We buy the north parcel. The spring stays protected. Kids keep their school. You keep your room." She blinked, uncertain. "And what do you keep?" Eli hesitated. Then he smiled, faint. "A neighbor with clean books and better handwriting than me." She looked down, lips tight. Across town, the church bell rang once. Inside the courthouse, the clerk stood with a sheaf of notices, each one stamped, signed, and smudged by morning fingers. The auction was quiet. No Prentlow proxy, No fancy hat bidders from Santa Fe or Laredo. Just a few ranchers, a widow with her hand on her son's shoulder, and Nora, arms folded, watching it all. The north parcel went up. "Opening bid?" the clerk asked. Silence. Then Eli raised his hand. 1,000 even. Heads turned. That was fair? Modest. "Do I hear more?" No one moved. After 3 heartbeats, the gavel dropped. "Sold." Hannah sat, her knees weak. She had written the numbers herself, known what they meant, but still, it felt like someone had dropped a mountain in her lap. Outside, she paused at the steps, looking west toward the low ridge where the spring wound through brush and cottonwood. "That's a lot of land," she whispered. "It's not just land," Eli said. "It's water and fence and room for kids to learn." "And work," she added, voice hushed. "Work I wasn't born to." Eli reached into his coat and handed her a folded paper. She opened it. A partnership agreement, simple, clear, legal, her name beside his, equal. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I know," he said, "but you earned it." She blinked. This isn't because of..." He stepped back, giving her space. "No expectations. You taught me that. But a ranch don't run on one back alone. You built half already. Just figured you should sign your name to it." She held the paper tight, fingers trembling. Back at the schoolhouse, the children were already seated. Nora had brought biscuits, and one of the boys had drawn the red door in charcoal on the blackboard. Tully sat on the porch with the preacher. "She'll stay, won't she?" the old prospector asked. The preacher smiled. "Some trains run late, but the ones that matter stop where they're needed." Hannah folded the agreement, tucking it into her journal. "I'll sign it," she said, "but not today." Eli tipped his hat. "Whenever it feels right." She turned, watching the breeze stir the cottonwoods by the spring. The ditch gate stood unlocked, the water flowing steady now. From the schoolroom came a burst of laughter, then the quiet thump of boots heading for chores. Hannah looked to the future and felt something ease, not relief, not triumph, something steadier, like the breath before dawn. And as snow clouds gathered in the distance, she said softly, "If the door stays red, I think I'll stay too." The winter after the auction came hard, but Eli had shored the west fence before the first frost, and Hannah had cured enough apples to fill 2 cellar crates. They didn't say much about it, they just worked, side by side, 1 foot, 1 rail, 1 breath at a time. The red door schoolhouse stood bright against the snow. Inside, children warmed their hands at the stove before lessons began. The new benches bore initials scratched lightly in the wood, but the rules posted near the chalkboard were clear, fair, and written in Hannah's careful hand. Eli kept the book straight, mended gear with quiet precision, and learned how to read contracts a little faster each month. Come spring, he built a lean-to for extra storage. By summer, he'd planted trees around the north pasture, and Hannah stayed. Not because she was stuck or owed anything. She stayed because the garden grew under her hand, because the bunkhouse porch faced morning light, because the children stopped by with spelling words and questions about the stars. Because when she spoke, Eli listened, and when she needed silence, he left her space. Late one Sunday, Nora visited with sweetbread and news. The county judge had returned to review outstanding fines. Prentlow, now stripped of his company post, stood in the churchyard with a black hat in his hands, apologizing aloud for the error and harm caused during my oversight. Some clapped, most didn't. They just nodded. That was enough. "I never thought I'd see that," Hannah murmured, brushing snow from her shawl. He glanced over. "Some men learn slow, but they learn, and some women take the long way home," she said. They walked together up the low hill behind the ranch. The ground was hard with frost, but their boots held steady. From there, they could see the spring line, the ditch gate, the tidy fence around the schoolyard. Their daughter toddled between them, red mittens flapping like wings. "She talks more every day," Eli said, lifting the girl as she squealed. "Takes after Nora," Hannah said, smiling, "and she loves that schoolroom. Just like her mother." Hannah watched the wind stir through the cottonwoods. The land stretched wide, modest, steady, forgiving. "You think we did right?" she asked, voice quiet. Eli looked down the slope. "We didn't win it all, but we kept our word. Built something honest. That counts." She nodded slowly. "You still carry the return fare, don't you?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. "I do," he said, untouched. She took it, held it for a long moment. Then she tore it clean in half. "Let's plant trees along the ridge this spring," she said, "for windbreak and memory." He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." They headed down the hill as dusk came on. Light curled across the snow in warm gold. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. A calf bawled low near the fence. Life kept on. No grand speech, no tin star on the chest, just a ledger made right, a porch swept clean, a school with warm benches and a red door, and a man and woman who met late, but met true. Some trains don't run on time, but they stop right where they're needed. If stories like this settle warm in your chest, stick with us, friend. Subscribe for more frontier tales worth the ride.